That was absolutely wonderful, sweetie. We're so incredibly proud of you.
You really outdid yourself this time.
I learned early how quiet a house could feel when you were standing in the middle of it. Ethan, try more potatoes, Mom said. You're too thin. She didn't look at me. I sat across the table, fork paused, watching her smile like it was new. Dad laughed. He eats like a bird, he said. Nothing like you at his age. I nodded because that was safer than speaking. Ethan moved in after his father died. Just until things settle, Mom told me. He needs us. I said, of course. I meant it then. The first week, Mom checked his homework. The second, Dad took him to the office. By the third, my chair felt temporary. Did you finish the report? Dad asked one night. I said, yes. Ethan said, I helped. Dad's eyes lit up. See? Initiative. I stared at my plate. It was my idea, I whispered. Mom frowned. Don't compete, she said. Support him. At Sunday lunch, Aunt Carol squeezed Ethan's shoulder. You're such a blessing, she said. Your parents raised you right. Dad smiled. We're proud of him. I waited. The silence answered me. Ethan said, I couldn't do it without Uncle Richard. Dad beamed. That's my boy. Later, in the kitchen, I asked Mom, did I do something wrong? She dried a plate. Why would you think that? I said, you don't ask me anything anymore. She sighed. You're older. Be mature. I said, I am. She said, then act like it. Ethan tried to be kind. Hey, he said in the hallway, thanks for letting me use your laptop. I said, you didn't ask. He smiled, careful. I thought it was fine. Dad called from the study, Ethan, come here. Ethan went. I stayed. At dinner, Dad said, Ethan has a head for numbers. Mom said, he's focused. I said, I got an A2. Dad waved a hand. This isn't about grades. Mom added, listen and learn. My chest felt tight. From him? I asked. The room froze. Ethan stared at his hands. The next week, Dad brought files home. Sit with me, he told Ethan. Watch how this works. I stood there. I can help, I said. Dad didn't look up. Later. Mom said, let them bond. I went upstairs and closed my door. At a family dinner, Dad cleared his throat. We've decided something important, he said. Mom reached for Ethan's arm. We want stability, she said. The business needs a steady future. Dad nodded. Ethan will start learning everything. Ethan whispered, I'll do my best. No one looked at me. I wanted to speak. I didn't. I counted my breaths. I felt small, like furniture. When the plates were cleared, Mom said, you understand, right? I said, yes. It was the easiest lie I ever told. After that, Dad stood again. One more thing, he said. Mom nodded. We talked with the board, she said. They agree. My heart thumped. Dad said, Ethan will be trained as my successor. The words landed heavy. Ethan gasped. Uncle, are you sure? Dad smiled. We are. Mom added, you have the temperament. I looked at my hands. I said nothing. A cousin clapped. Someone said, congratulations. Ethan said, I won't disappoint. Dad said, that's what family does. I swallowed. I wanted to ask where I fit. I wanted to scream. Instead, I smiled. I'm happy for you, I said. My voice sounded borrowed. Later, Mom touched my arm. You're quiet, she said. I said, I'm fine. Dad said, be supportive. I said, I always am. Ethan met my eyes. I didn't ask for this, he said softly. I said, enjoy it. He nodded, unsure. That night, I lay awake. The house creaked. I listened to their laughter downstairs. I told myself I was imagining it. I told myself love could be shared. But I knew the truth then. I wasn't their choice. I was the spare. I watched Ethan laugh with Dad. Mom poured wine. This is the start, Dad said. We'll shape you. Ethan said, I'll learn. Mom said, we believe in you. I stood. I'll get some air, I said. No one stopped me. Outside, the night felt cold. I breathed and counted again. I promised myself I would leave one day. I promised I would become someone they couldn't overlook. Not today, but soon, I would choose myself, even if it meant losing them forever. I walked back inside, quiet, already gone in my heart, before anyone noticed me there. I heard my name before I heard my footsteps. He's too emotional, Mom said. I froze outside the study. Dad replied, Ethan stays calm. Papers rustled. Ethan laughed softly. I just follow instructions, he said. I stood there, holding my breath, feeling smaller with every word. At breakfast, Dad said, Ethan, take the client call today. I said, I prepared those notes. Dad replied, let him handle it. Mom added, you get nervous. I said, I don't. She smiled tight. That's what worries me. Later, I cornered Mom in the kitchen. Why don't you trust me? I asked. She said, trust isn't the issue. I said, then what is? She sighed. You feel everything. Business needs distance. I asked, so I should stop feeling? She said, be more like Ethan. The words cut deeper than shouting. I met Sarah at the park. You look wrecked, she said. I shrugged. Family stuff. She said, again? I nodded. She handed me coffee. Talk. I said, they chose him. She frowned. They're wrong. I laughed. They don't think so. She said, what do you think? I went quiet. She waited. I think I'm disposable, I said. She squeezed my hand. You're not. At work, Ethan smiled at me. Good morning, he said. I said, did you read my proposal? He nodded. Brilliant. I relaxed. In the meeting, Dad said, Ethan suggested a new plan. Ethan spoke my words. My chest burned. I interrupted. That was mine. Dad frowned. Don't interrupt. Mom said, let him finish. Ethan avoided my eyes. After, I said, you took my idea. Ethan whispered, we're a team. I said, say my name. He smiled. It doesn't matter. Dad walked over. Problem? I said, yes. Dad said, not here. Mom added, be professional. That evening, I heard Dad say, Ethan delivers. Mom replied, he's reliable. Dad said, our son is volatile. I leaned against the wall. My stomach dropped. Ethan said, I'll handle the rollout. Dad said, good. I went to my room. Sarah texted, you okay? I typed, no, she called. Tell me. I said, they erased me. She said, then write yourself back in. I stared at the ceiling. I said, they won't let me. She said, then leave. I said, not yet. I opened my notebook. My ideas stared back, orphaned. I realized the truth. I wasn't unheard. I was unwanted. In this house, loyalty had a voice, and it wasn't mine. I stayed awake, listening to the house breathe. Dad knocked once. Sleep, he said. I said, I'm working. He replied, Ethan finished early. I bit my tongue. The next morning, Mom said, Ethan will present. I asked, why? She said, he's steady. I said, I can be. She said, you react. Ethan said, I'll cover everything. I watched him carry my future like luggage. Sarah met me after work. They did it again, I said. She said, say no. I said, I did. She said, then do something louder. I shook my head. They won't hear me. She said, then hear yourself. At dinner, Dad raised a glass. To progress, he said. Mom smiled at Ethan. To leadership, she said. I lifted water. To honesty, I said. Silence followed. Ethan cleared his throat. I appreciate the trust, he said. Dad nodded. You earned it. I stared at the table. In my room, I spoke out loud. I'm alone. The words didn't echo. They settled. I felt scared, then calm. If I was alone, I was free to choose. I closed my notebook and decided to stop asking permission to exist. I remembered every time I waited for approval. I deleted drafts. I saved emails. I swallowed anger. Tonight, I didn't. I planned quietly. I listed skills. I listed exits. I whispered, I choose me. The house stayed silent. That was answer enough. My phone buzzed. It was Sarah. You there? She wrote. I typed, still here. She replied, not for long. I smiled. Tomorrow would hurt. Staying hurt more. I lay down, eyes open, heart loud, waiting for morning, waiting for my chance to speak without permission. I didn't know how. I only knew I would. The betrayal had spoken. Now, I would answer. The night felt longer. My resolve felt heavier. I closed my eyes and stopped pretending I belonged. I was done asking to be chosen. I would choose myself, starting tomorrow. No applause. No permission. Just truth. And I finally listened. That was enough. For me. Dinner started normal. That was the worst part. Dad said, sit. Mom said, eat before it gets cold. Ethan nodded and passed the salt. I watched his hands shake, just a little. I thought maybe he felt it too. Dad cleared his throat. We need to talk. Mom folded her napkin. About the project, she said. I said, which one? Dad said, the future. My stomach dropped. I carried that deal, I said. I stayed late. Dad replied, lower your voice. Mom said, this isn't an attack. I laughed. It feels like one. Ethan stayed quiet, eyes on his plate. Dad said, Ethan handles pressure better. I said, because you give him room. Mom said, you make things personal. I asked, am I not allowed to? Dad slammed his hand. Enough. I stood. Say it, I said. Say what you mean. Dad looked at me, tired. He's more of a son to me, he said. The words hit hard. I felt hollow. Mom didn't argue. Ethan didn't speak. I said, I'm right here. Dad said, sit down. I said, no. Mom said, you're overreacting. I laughed, broken. You chose him. Dad said, we chose stability. I asked, and I'm what? Silence answered. I turned to Ethan. Say something. He swallowed. I don't want this fight. I said, you already won. He looked away. Mom said, you're hurting everyone. I said, you hurt me first. Dad said, you're emotional. I said, I learned it here. No one denied it. I went upstairs. My hands shook as I pulled a bag from the closet. I heard voices below. Mom said, he'll calm down. Dad said, he always does. Ethan said nothing. I packed fast. Shirts. Laptop. Notebook. I stopped at a photo and turned it face down. My phone buzzed. Sarah. What's happening? She asked. I typed, I'm leaving. She called. Don't vanish, she said. I said, I need space to breathe. She said, come to me. I said, not tonight. I walked downstairs. Dad said, where are you going? I said, away. Mom said, this is dramatic. I said, so was choosing him. Ethan whispered, I'm sorry. I said, I believe you. It didn't change anything. At the door, Mom said, you'll regret this. I said, I already do. Dad said, don't make threats. I said, I'm making a promise. He scoffed. To who? I said, myself. Outside, the air felt sharp. Sarah texted again. Please. I replied, I'll call tomorrow. I sat on the curb and breathed. My chest hurt. My eyes burned. I didn't cry. I looked back once. The light stayed on. No one followed. I nodded to myself. Okay, I said. Okay. I walked. Each step felt lighter and heavier. I thought about every dinner I swallowed words. Every idea I lost. Every time I tried to be chosen. I stopped trying. I said it out loud, quiet. If they never wanted me, I'll become someone they can't ignore. The night didn't argue. My phone rang. Sarah again. Where are you? She asked. I said, moving. She said, I'm proud of you. I said, I'm scared. She said, that means it matters. I kept walking. I didn't know where I would sleep. I knew why I left. The house behind me felt smaller with every step. My name felt bigger. I didn't look back again. I didn't need closure. I needed distance. I needed time. I needed myself. Tonight, I chose me, even if it cost everything. The street was quiet. My heart wasn't. I welcomed that noise. It meant I was still alive, still mine, finally free to become something new, starting now. The apartment smelled like dust and instant noodles. I said, this is temporary, to no one. The walls didn't answer. My phone buzzed. Sarah texted, did you eat? I typed, yes. It was a lie. She replied, be careful. I stared at the ceiling and said, I am. At work, I kept my head down. Marcus noticed. You're early, he said. I said, I can't sleep. He shrugged. Then work. I nodded. He watched me longer than usual. You angry? He asked. I said, focused. He smirked. Same thing sometimes. Days blurred. Cheap meals. Long nights. I whispered, don't fail, like a prayer. Sarah called. You sound different, she said. I said, I'm tired. She said, or changing. I didn't answer. Marcus stopped by my desk. You redo this? He asked. I said, yes. He said, why? I said, it wasn't enough. He leaned closer. Who told you that? I said, everyone. He shook his head. Not me. One night, he said, beer? I said, I don't drink. He said, then talk. I followed him outside. He said, what's chasing you? I said, failure. He laughed. Good. Fear keeps you honest. I said, it keeps me awake. He said, use it. He pushed harder. Stop apologizing, he said. I said, I'm used to it. He said, unlearn it. I said, how? He said, earn your space. I nodded. I worked late. Marcus checked my screen. Better, he said. I said, not done. He smiled. That's hunger. I felt seen. Sarah met me for coffee. You're distant, she said. I said, I'm building. She said, don't forget me. I said, I won't. She searched my face. Who are you becoming? I said, someone solid. She nodded, unsure. At home, I counted coins. I said, you're fine. I wasn't sure. I opened my notebook. Plans replaced questions. I stopped asking why they didn't love me. I asked, what do I want? Marcus tested me. Present this, he said. I said, me? He said, you. My hand shook. I spoke anyway. He clapped once. Again, he said. I breathed. I spoke better. Sarah texted, proud of you. I replied, trying. She sent a heart. I stared at it longer than I should. I failed small. I fixed fast. Marcus nodded. That's growth, he said. I said, I'm scared. He said, good. I smiled, tired. Nights stayed long. The apartment stayed quiet. I talked to myself. You chose this. I believed it. I taped goals to the wall. I crossed one off. I whispered, more. Marcus said, you don't need revenge. I said, I know. He said, then what? I said, respect. He said, from who? I paused. From me. Sarah asked, do you miss them? I said, sometimes. She said, that's human. I said, so is leaving. She nodded. I ate better. Slept longer. Spoke clearer. Marcus said, you're ready. I said, for what? He said, the next step. I smiled, nervous. I stood in my apartment and breathed. This is mine, I said. The walls listened. I wasn't nothing anymore. I was becoming. I didn't need answers from the past. I needed direction. I chose forward. The promotion email was short. Effective immediately. I read it twice. Marcus said, you earned it. I said, quietly. He smiled. That's the best kind. In meetings, people used my name. That was his model, someone said. I didn't flinch. I nodded and spoke. Marcus leaned back. See, he whispered. Credit sticks when you do. He introduced me to Helen over lunch. This is the one, he said. Helen shook my hand. You're careful, she said. I asked, is that bad? She smiled. It's rare. I explained an idea. She interrupted. Don't apologize. I stopped. She nodded. Good. Sarah called that night. I heard something, she said. I said, about me. She paused. About Ethan. I waited. He's slipping, she said. Big calls. Bad timing. I closed my eyes. Are they okay? She sighed. They're worried. At work, Helen said, pitch again. I said, now? She said, always. I spoke. She listened. You're solid, she said. I said, I had to be. She replied, then keep going. Sarah texted later. Dad lost a client, she wrote. I stared at the screen. I typed, I'm sorry. I meant it and didn't. That scared me. I said out loud, what does that make me? Marcus noticed. You drifting, he said. I said, family noise. He said, mute it. I said, trying. He said, success helps. I ran into Mom at the cafe. She froze. Oh, she said. I said, hi. She looked me over. You look well. I said, I am. She nodded, unsure. Work, she asked. I said, busy. She smiled thin. Ethan is under pressure. I said, I heard. She said, it's hard. I said, it is. She asked, are you happy? I paused. I'm steady. She swallowed. That's good. Silence stretched. She said, we should talk. I said, another time. She nodded. Of course. She left first. Sarah called again. Mom's stressed, she said. I replied, I saw her. Sarah said, she didn't expect that. I said, neither did I. Sarah asked, do you feel bad? I said, I feel quiet. Helen emailed. Partner meeting tomorrow. I smiled. Marcus said, you ready? I said, I think so. He said, you are. I believed him. At the meeting, Helen said, this strategy is his. Heads turned. I spoke. No one interrupted. After, Helen said, you don't chase applause. I said, I chased it once. She said, now you don't need it. Sarah messaged. Ethan blamed staff, she wrote. Dad defended him. I typed, that won't last. I felt cold saying it. I felt honest too. I walked home and said, this isn't revenge. The street agreed. I didn't plan this. I worked. I healed. The rest followed. Marcus said, karma's boring, he joked. It's just cause and effect. I said, then it's loud. He laughed. Mom texted that night. Proud of you. I stared at it. I didn't reply. I wasn't ready to carry her feelings again. Helen called. We move fast, she said. I said, I can keep up. She said, I know. I hung up and breathed. Sarah asked, what now? I said, forward. She said, no looking back? I said, not for revenge. She smiled. Good. I sat alone and felt nothing sharp. No anger. No joy. Just balance. I realized I didn't need to win against them. I already had my life back. Karma didn't shout. It whispered. And I listened. I heard the shouting before I saw them. Dad said, you ignored the warnings. Mom replied, you let him decide alone. I stopped outside the door. Ethan said nothing. That scared me more. Dad called me later. Come home, he said. I replied, why? He hesitated. We need you. I asked, for what? He said, stability. I laughed once. You chose differently. Sarah filled the gaps. He rushed the deal, she said. Lost money. I asked, how much? She exhaled. Enough. I closed my eyes. Part of me felt relief. Another part felt empty. Ethan texted. We should talk. I replied, about what? He wrote, us. I waited, then said, fine. We met outside the office. He didn't smile. You enjoying this? He asked. I said, no, he scoffed. You waited for me to fall. I said, I waited for nothing. He stepped closer. You always resented me. I said, I resented being erased. He snapped, you could help. I said, you never asked before. He said, you wanted this. I shook my head. You did this. He stared at me, angry and scared. They trust you now, he said. I replied, they're afraid. Dad called again. Please, he said. Talk to the board. I asked, why me? He said, you have credibility. I said, you gave that away. He went quiet. We made mistakes. I said, I paid for them. Mom came to see me. He's drowning, she said. I replied, so was I. She said, this is different. I asked, because it's him? She flinched. Because we're family. I said, when was I? She cried. Help us, she said. I looked away. I can't, I said. Not like this. She whispered, you're punishing us. I said, I'm protecting myself. Marcus asked, you okay? I said, they want me back. He said, do you want that? I paused. I want peace. He nodded. Then choose it. Ethan cornered me again. Say something, he demanded. I said, listen. He clenched his fists. You think you're better. I said, I think I'm done. He laughed, bitter. You owe me. I said, I owe myself. He said, if you help, they'll forgive you. I replied, I don't need forgiveness. He froze. I continued, I needed respect. He looked away. At home, the house felt louder. Dad said, we're losing control. Mom said, we need him. Ethan snapped, he won't come. I stood there unseen. I chose to stay quiet. Sarah asked, will you step in? I said, no, she said, that's hard. I said, so was begging. I wrote nothing. I signed nothing. My silence stretched. Calls went unanswered. Meetings moved on without me. The power shifted because I didn't chase it. Dad texted, we're sorry. I didn't reply. Not yet. Maybe never. I sat alone and asked myself, am I cruel? The answer came steady. No, I wasn't pushing them down. I was standing still. Ethan sent one last message. I thought you'd save me. I typed, you never saved me. I deleted it. Silence said more. For once, I wasn't pleading. I wasn't explaining. I wasn't shrinking. I was choosing. And that choice felt heavier than anger, cleaner than revenge, and finally, fully mine. The house felt smaller when I walked in. Mom said, thank you for coming. I said, I'm not staying. Dad nodded, tired. We know. Ethan sat on the couch, head down. Mom spoke first. I'm sorry, she said. I waited. She added, I should have listened. I asked, when? She swallowed. Before it broke. I said, it broke long ago. She nodded, tears falling. I know. Dad said, the business is bleeding. I replied, I heard. He said, we made the wrong call. I said, you made many. Silence followed. Ethan looked up. I never wanted to replace you, he said. I said, you did. He shook his head. They pushed me. I replied, you let them. He clenched his jaw. I was scared. I said, so was I. He stood. I tried to be perfect, he said. I thought if I succeeded, I'd belong. I asked, and me? He whispered, I didn't think about you. The honesty hurt more than lies. Mom said, can you forgive us? I said, I don't know. Dad said, we're your parents. I replied, that was never enough. He looked away. Helen called. We're ready, she said. I asked, for what? She said, partnership. I smiled. Send the terms. She laughed. Already did. I looked at my parents. I have an offer, I said. Dad asked, with us? I said, no. Mom gasped. It's bigger, I added. Cleaner. Ethan stared. You're leaving for good? I said, I already left. Ethan stepped closer. I'm sorry, he said again. I said, I believe you. He asked, is that forgiveness? I answered, it's understanding. He nodded, broken. Mom reached for my hand. Stay, she said. I pulled back gently. I can't heal here. She cried harder. We need you. I said, I need me. Dad said, we should have chosen you. I replied, you don't get to choose now. He closed his eyes. I walked outside. Sarah waited. How was it? She asked. I said, honest. She said, and? I said, heavy. She hugged me. I'm proud of you. I said, me too. Helen texted. Welcome aboard. I typed, let's build. My hands didn't shake. Inside, Mom called out, we love you. I paused. I said, I hope you do. I didn't turn back. Sarah asked, do you regret it? I said, no. She said, you sound calm. I said, I am. Later, Ethan messaged. Take care. I replied, you too. That was all. I signed the papers the next day. Helen said, you're free. I said, I know. She smiled. You earned it. That night, I thought about the boy I was. Waiting. Hoping. Breaking. I wasn't him anymore. I didn't win by replacing anyone. I won by refusing to disappear. I chose my future. I chose respect. I chose distance over damage. The heir they never expected was never theirs to claim. He was always mine. I stood in front of the house with my hands in my pockets. Mom opened the door slowly. You came, she said. I nodded. Just to talk. Dad stood behind her, silent. Ethan wasn't there. That felt right. Mom said, do you want tea? I said, no. She stepped aside anyway. The hallway smelled the same. I said, I won't stay long. Dad said, we understand. I believed him this time. We sat. Mom spoke carefully. We didn't know how much we hurt you. I replied, you knew. You just chose not to see it. She lowered her eyes. That's fair. Dad added, we lost you. I said, you let me go. Dad cleared his throat. I was proud of you, he said. I asked, when? He paused. I didn't say it. I nodded. That was the problem. He didn't argue. Mom whispered, I wish we could start over. I said, I already did. She reached for my arm and stopped herself. Are you happy? She asked. I smiled. I'm at peace. Her eyes filled. That matters. I stood. I came to say goodbye. Dad said, not forever? I said, not today. He nodded. Thank you for coming. I said, thank you for listening. At the door, Mom said, we see you now. I replied, I hope you do. I stepped outside. The door closed gently. I didn't feel chased by ghosts anymore. Sarah waited by the car. You okay? She asked. I said, yes. She studied my face. Really? I nodded. I'm done fighting. She smiled. Good. We drove in silence. Then she said, I never asked what you wanted. I said, I want to keep growing. She said, with me? I laughed softly. If we choose it. She reached over. I choose it. We stopped by the park. Sarah said, you're different. I said, I'm lighter. She said, you don't need to prove anything. I replied, I know. She leaned back. That suits you. She asked, do you hate him? I shook my head. No, she said, forgive him. I answered, I released him. She nodded. That's stronger. My phone buzzed. A message from Dad. Take care. I typed, you too. That was enough. I walked alone for a while. I spoke quietly. You did it. The words felt solid. I thought about the boy waiting at tables, holding his breath. I thanked him for surviving. Sarah called. Dinner, she asked. I said, soon. She said, I'll wait. I smiled. Me too. I passed the house once more, from the street. The lights were on. I didn't stop. I didn't need to. I realized something simple. I didn't surpass Ethan by becoming the heir. I surpassed him by becoming whole. No comparisons. No auditions. Just me. I breathed in. I breathed out. The past stayed where it belonged. I walked forward without looking back. I didn't need approval. I had direction. I didn't need victory. I had peace. Sarah texted, "Ready?" I replied, "Yes." I stepped into my future, steady and clear. The quiet followed me, not as loneliness, but as calm. I wasn't chosen then. I chose myself now. And that choice carried me farther than their love ever could.